morning, everyone. This is a new opportunity to know a little bit more about international co-productions, especially regarding copyright and international treaties. I have the pleasure to have talking with me my very good friend and colleague, Sam Coppola from Canada, Montreal, who is an expert on copyright productions and especially international treaties.
Hi, Alberto, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone over there. My name is Sam Coppola. As maybe you can see, it's actually Saverio Coppola. Sam is what I would suppose the Americans would call me. I'm a lawyer. I'm a tax lawyer and practicing mainly in the entertainment field in Canada, Montreal, Canada. I specialize a lot in what we call these co-productions, because they are quite complex structures and require a professional assistance on it. So my main practice has been either representing producers and financiers, bankers in the area of film, television, new media, and these tax credits that come along with it.
Because of the great Italian community in Canada and because of the very efficient tax treaty, bilateral treaty between Italy and Canada, there has been a lot of co-productions done between Italy and Canada, and you and I have been involved in several of these. What is the benefit to enter a co-production, a traditional co-production?
Here we're dealing, I guess, with Italian producers who want to collaborate with Canadian producers, or vice versa. We have Canadian producers who want to collaborate with Italian producers. And they have various ways of doing so. The first one, and the most common one that I think everyone will look at, is to collaborate under a co-production arrangement. A co-production arrangement is essentially two producers who co-produce one film or one project or a series and so forth together. The Canadian government and the Italian government were actually, I think Italy was the first country to actually sign a co-production treaty with Canada. That treaty itself provides that if you meet the conditions of the treaty, Italy will recognize that your film will be an Italian film, and Canada will recognize that your film is a Canadian film. And that carries with it various advantages to it. However, there are rules that are required to be met. So the first part is that you have to share the copyright of the film, and the minimum.
That's a big issue, Stan, because obviously it requires a mutual trust, because each party has to take the burden in somehow, even of the costs. And that will lead us to make a distinction with what is a service.
So the moment that you, like you said, share the copyright, the most important element of a co-production is the trust that you have to have with your partner. So choosing your co-production partner is very, very important. And the minimum allocation is 80%, 20%. So it could be minimum 20 Italian, 80 Canadian, or vice versa. It could be 50-50. You really determine that more by where you spend the money. Because the moment that you have an 80-20 co-production or 50-50 co-production, you're technically supposed to spend 80-20 within those respective countries.
And be careful, spend, not necessarily shoot. So that means you can do post-production and spend more, or special effects in Canada and shoot a greater part in Italy. Yes.
Yeah, so there's a whole exercise also that is required to actually spend the money within these two jurisdictions. And there are restrictions that you cannot engage third countries. So obviously, Italians and Canadians are enamored with Americans to participate. You can only get an American actor or actress to come in, and you can only have a small minority of any participation other than the countries of Italy and Canada. Now, Italy itself has extended that to being European. So this does mean that you have a much broader selection to choose from, but all your participants have to come from these countries. So there is a little bit of a rigidity within that component of the co-production. And many times, given those three factors, you may not come to terms to actually go under the co-production route. And there are other ways of doing it which are a little more flexible.
So there are a lot of producers that look at this as an El Dorado, but let's put things clear. you can't start an international co-production if you don't have at least a bulk of money. Or how could we answer if they just do everything on soft money, on the treaty itself? Could that be possible?
The treaty alone will, like I said, means that you can get national recognition in Canada. Now, once you have national recognition in Canada, what does that mean? Well, that means that your film qualifies for support from various funding agencies. So there are a federal agency called Telefilm, there are provincial agencies, one in Quebec called SODEC, and there are other funds that come in and would support. So you basically line up and say, hey, this is a Canadian film because it's Italian co-production treaty, and these agencies will fund a percentage of this budget. Apart from agencies coming in, there is what we call the tax credits, the film tax credits. And these, we call them the content tax credits because your film is recognized as Canadian. And you can get, federally, 25% of your labor spend, Canadian labor spend. Provincially, you can get 35%, and you can't combine one with the other. It's in other words, it's 25% of 65% because you got 35% coming from the provincial side. So you're getting maybe 25, 30% of your budget that you spend in Canada coming from tax credits. You may get another, whatever, 20, 30% coming from these funding agencies. So that is what we would normally call your soft money, but you now need still the balance of this budget to be financed. Often you pre-sell the territory. So you may have a television distributor that comes in, a broadcaster that comes in and brings in a certain percentage. In certain cases, that could be sufficient, and your Canadian side is financed that way. Sometimes you need to do international pre-sales to complement that aspect to complete that production.
But Sam, would you agree, based on our mutual experience, that an international co-production based on the treaty is worth, due the great bulk of paperwork to be done, is worth if there's a fairly large production? It will be useful to get into such a deep rabbit hole if the production is a low budget.
I agree, and there's minimums that I think that make it, because the moment that you deal with two countries, everything gets more complicated. You've got a lot of bureaucratic situations to claim tax credits. I mean, these tax credits and funds don't come, with a check at the day you make your application. They have to be financed. They have to be, so you've got, a lot of different costs that are associated with it. I mean, I have seen film co-productions in the 5 to 6 million. I think that would be probably the lowest amounts that I think would justify it. I think you're better off with we're doing one just recently. It's actually a France-Canada co-production. It's about 13 million. I think at 13 million, that's a nice level because it allows for some above-the-line actors to come in, more recognized, and gives you a lot more flexibility when you're, choosing and permitting the crew and special effects and so forth. So yes, I think that your budget numbers do have to have a certain size to justify it. There are other ways of doing it. For instance, if you're doing a series, series have had interesting structures where we call twinnings. For instance, you can take one episode that is done in Italy and twin it with another episode that is done in Canada, and it avoids some of those complications of having to, each one of your episodes, your production has to have that double country spend. So in special, the limited series, and in different types of series, potentially you can look at what we call the twinning effect, and it makes it a little easier to get into that co-production mode.
Can you give us any example case studies about twinnings?
There is Hallmark does these romance sort of films that are broadcast on the Hallmark channels and so forth. Mm-hmm. And those Hallmark films, if you look at them, many of them are actually, one is done in Canada and another one is done in Europe. And those are actually put together as a twinning effect, a twinning in a co-production.
Now, obviously, the treaty doesn't extend just to cinema and theatrical release. You were talking prior to our meeting about TV co-venture.
What we've seen sometimes, because like I mentioned, the treaty was signed in 1997, by the way. The treaty has the rigidity to it. So if you don't fit within the treaty, you can still collaborate with Canada or a Canadian production company under what we call the co-venture. Now, remember, the advantages of the treaty were your film would be recognized as Canadian. In a co-venture, what happens is the Italian, for instance, has a project and wants to have an American look. They come to Canada, they get into a co-venture arrangement where they own the copyright. So now they're not sharing the copyright. But the Canadian producer has to meet what we call content requirements, which means that there are points systems, and I think Europe has point systems also.
It does, yes.
Where you have key creatives that have to come from the country. So, for instance, between the director and the writer, one of them should be Canadian. Between the first actor or second highest actor, one of them should be Canadian. And then you have a selection between editor, composer, and so forth. So you need 5 points. So if you can get 5 points, okay, so you get some key people from Canada, the Italian owns the copyright, you put that together and you do it as a co-venture, there is a certification process by the CRTC, which then recognizes that production as Canadian. Now, and what does that mean? That means that your Italian series, okay, if you were just going to come over to Canada and try to license it to broadcasters, they pay you very little money per episode because it's not a Canadian series. However, the moment that it's certified as a Canadian co-venture series, it has Canadian nationality, and you can get hundreds of thousands of dollars per episode for the same series. And now, that's an interesting way to come over. And
that sounds super interesting, especially in the moment of crisis where the theatrical release is still a huge question mark. Yeah. Obviously, you need to have a good relationship with a broadcast that will fill in the requirement to make the co-venture co-venture work. But let me ask you this. As the producer's ability is that to juggle around the elements above the line, obviously, and obviously the story, how important it is to trigger the right requirement? Does the content need to be Canadian? Can it be of Italian community in Canada, or a story that ties the two nations? Or could it be simply an action movie that it's staged in Toronto, for example, in Canada? In effect, it's just done by Italian and a Canadian producers, and it's supposed to be in the United States or New York?
I think all of them can work. I think that there is no content requirement per se. You do have to spend a certain amount of money in Canada. So the moment that you have that requirement, you obviously need Canadian elements within your story. Now, the word Canadian means, to me, North American. You do need a certain percentage that has to be done in Canada on the spend itself. But that doesn't mean that it has to be the whole shooting. It's obvious that your best natural co-ventures and co-productions are stories that are based within the two countries or within the two, but they are not restricted to that. There isn't an actual legislative restriction that says this must be Canadian-based or US-based or Italian-based or anything. It could be, it's going to be the creativity of the producers and how they can work it together and so forth.
Obviously, the star system and the American star system still determines a great deal of pre-production, financial packaging of the projects. How can all what we've said right now work when the two parties, Italian and Canadian producers, need a US actor?
Well, one actor is fine, right? And maybe even two with a cameo role or whatever it is under the treaty co-production. Under the co-venture, you could have multiple actors from the US itself. But if you truly have a lot of US elements within it, then I think what you're going to look at is what I call the third way of collaborating, which is that you come to Canada and you do what is called a service production. A service production means an Italian film comes over here, owned 100% by the Italian producer, okay, and just does its spend over here and can hire anyone in the world, including Americans and Asians or whoever, okay? And you will get a percentage of your spend locally. It's a services credit. Right. When you come over under the services deal. So it's based on your spend. So if you spend $1 million in Quebec, you'll get 20% from the provincial government back, okay? And you'll get 16% of the Canadian labor. So it may be that Quebec is an all spend. In other words, your hotels, your car rentals, it doesn't only have to be services. Federally, they will only look at your labor components that they get qualified. So you calculate your Canadian labor, which could be, let's say, 500,000. You've got 20% from the Quebec government, so you take away 20% of that, so that's 400,000. On 400,000, you'll get 16% of that. So you got 20. You got 20% of $1 million from Quebec and 16% of 400,000 from the federal for a service deal. Service deal, complete creative freedom. All it is they calculate what you spend in the territory and you multiply by a percentage and you get that tax credit. Now that tax credit is not cash on delivery when you produce the film. You only get that. You have to engage a service company in Canada. You have to have a company that is incorporated in Canada, that does business in Canada, that pays taxes in Canada. So that's usually your line producer. Sometimes you refer to it as the executive producer for the purposes of European or French, and it's different. An executive producer in America is a different concept than executant or executive in Europe.
It's the box company that transfers basically a great part of the advantage.
Yeah. So that entity then applies for the tax credits when they file their tax returns, and let's say 6 months after that they get the credit. So it can take about a year before you'll see it. So what do the most producers do is they finance that. Here in Canada, there's a really good banking system. 3 of the major banks have very well developed teams who can finance these tax credits at very good rates. I mean, rates have increased, the interest rates have increased recently, but it's still a very good cost of money.
Well, let's explain a little bit this issue, which is huge, and sometimes it's not given the right importance. When on the paper a producer receives the tax credit, it's based on the expenditure, which means it has to spend that money, and then it will get a portion of that money back. The question, the issue here is when. And that when can take even 6 or even a year, which means there is exposure, a financial, economical exposure of the producer that has to pay back sometimes the equity investor or the lender. Obviously, that is a cost. In the world right now, we are several banks, especially in Paris and especially in Montreal, that are applying a midnight fluctuation rate in order to compete, as opposed to the Euribor. That is an important and leverage to the producer that has to pay back the money lent, or the investor to get the return with a less expenditure, less cost of the money invested.
Yes, so Canadian banks used to use the LIBOR rate. There's now something, SOFR, there are these overnight rates. They will apply those rates and add a couple of percentage points, or they'll apply something like a prime rate. If you're borrowing in Canadian dollars, for instance, it's usually a prime rate, which is the lowest rate that banks, the central bank lends to other banks, and they add a percentage above that. So you're not talking very high rates and very reasonable rates, but you do have to calculate that within your budget. So in other words, if you have $1 million of tax credits coming to you, the bank will not finance $1 million. They will finance a percentage of that. 90% is often what we see. So you'll get 900,000 of it, but the other 100,000 they'll charging you an interest rate. So if the interest rate is, let's say, 6%, it works out to. So you'll have 6% on that 900,000 owing, and if it takes a year, then the other 10% that isn't been financed can be used to pay off that interest rate. So 90%, there's a reserve that's done for the other amount that's not financed, and then that is equal to what you often pay for the interest within it. And sometimes if you have to close in a hurry, okay, you can get an accountant who'll give you a tax opinion, or we can help also on that side. And the banks could finance you before you get your certificate or recognition from the government. They'll finance you based on an auditor's opinion, and they'll maybe finance 75% of that tax credit. So that permits the producers to have cash when they go into production.
And it's an immense advantage, this.
Oh, for sure. But you have to work it into your budget. In other words, on the D level of your budget, okay, those indirect costs have to have some amount for financing itself. One component that we should mention is that if you're in a service environment, you can do this without a completion bond. But if you're in a co-production or a content type arrangement, the treaties require that the film be completed before you get the credits. So that risk of completion, many Canadian banks require a completion bond. This is something that I think is less usual within the European system, but here, because of the fact that a significant amount of the collateral that the bank is financing has what is called that completion risk, the banks don't usually like to take those risks themselves.
And they want to outsource the risk.
Right. One way to deal with that is that instead of getting your financing at the time that you're in production shooting or principal photography, you wait until principal photography is over, and that's when you start borrowing the money from the bank. Because the moment the principal photography is over, the risk of completion is significantly reduced.
Yeah, of course.
Well, it's not zero because, you still have the post, and there are many times these special effects, but, a bank, okay, could then call upon another entity to actually complete the film.
Now, Sam, let me bring up an hybrid situation, which is the most common of all. An American independent producer wants to shoot in Italy, an Italian content, and obviously relies on the Italian box company or executive company, as we mentioned before, which goes around shopping for the right bank to monetize the tax credit and the subsidies and even the distribution. How can the competitive banks that we've mentioned, we haven't said the names, obviously, for obvious reasons, how could these banks come in and make things easier?
The Canadian banks and some of the American banks themselves are quite used to financing film productions, and their rates are based on the competitive rates that they have here. So they're not necessarily competing with Italian banks that may have set a different competitive environment. So like I said, they understand the whole concept right away of the financing component. They will require some expertise to firm up the fact that the project does qualify for Italian tax credits. Like you said, these service companies, it's not a big risk in that sense that you spend money and then you'll have a certain amount of service credits coming from Italy. We understand those itself. The Canadian banks understand those here. And that aspect of assessing the risk is similar to what they will do here in Montreal or in Canada. So you're getting North American financing in Italy, okay, because they're able to, set it up that way and be much more competitive than anyone local there.
So right now we've stated something in a very subtle way, which is quite revolutionary, because usually foreign productions, especially American productions, come to Italy, get sometimes treated as tourists, so they have to shop around and find the right trustworthy entity. And then obviously that entity will go to the traditional banks, which will apply a non-competitive rate. Therefore, the American producer will have to wait an enormous amount of time with an applied not competitive rate of interest on the money lent.
Yeah, by having this financing structure in place, we can easily facilitate much more productions coming to Italy itself, because you're using the structure that's here that has been, well developed for, more than 100 years, I guess, now of cinema. Yesterday, I was over at one of these awards ceremonies at a school of cinema. One of the awards is the first 100 years of cinema.
Wow.
And apparently the first 100 years of cinema is like from 1890 or 1885, right, to 1985, that first 100 years. So we're in the second 100 years of cinema now.
Well, Sam, thank you. We've covered in about 30 minutes a lot of the scraping the surface, and
we've definitely only did the surface component.
Okay. Sam, thank you very much. See you next
All right.
time.
Thank you for having me, and ciao, arrivederci, ci vediamo, speriamo dentro una coproduzione insieme.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam.
I woke up this morning